As a short background, my process has always been very easy and wonderful. 15 years of meditation and yoga gave me a lot of energy, health and awareness. 5 years ago, I found Igor and started to watch all the videos and to engage with his incredibly wise, loving way. During this time, my process took a different turn. My body was having strong nerve pain, mostly around the shoulders and neck, especially after I had worked with people. At the same time, I realized that I can feel what others feel in my body and think thoughts of others. I started to test this when the pain came, followed by the changed perception. I went out of the room. Immediately, I had strong kriyas. After them, I felt myself again without the symptoms, until I was again in a relation to a person. It became stronger and stronger. Even when I was not in a room with the people, it is still like that, only that I trust my perception and surrender to it. It is difficult to conduct relationships because people are irritated by it, sometimes get scared. I try to hide it, but then the pain comes. So, 2 questions, or rather set of questions in 2 groups with regard to this. Do you think the reason which pathway Kundalini takes is a result of samskara, unresolved karmic seeds, and so as a result of unresolved experiences and psychic imprints? If this is so, I'm wondering if time and sadhana would repair the pathway Kundalini has chosen. If this is wrong, what do you say is the reason which channel Kundalini takes? So let's deal with this one first. Well, actually, we already touched upon this theme before when we talked about potential situations when Kundalini chooses the inappropriate pathway to ascent. And with reference to that particular module, when we talked about all the legitimate ways of Kundalini rising, along with those that are undesirable, you may recall that only 3 pathways out of 6 are considered to be that what leads to the desired goal. So that's Brahma, Saraswati, and Sushumna. Brahma, Chitrini, and Sushumna Nadis. All within Sushumna, within the shaft of Sushumna, at times called Merudanda altogether. So, in other words, within that overall Sushumna, there's a Sushumna ascent, Chitrini ascent, and Brahma Nadi ascent. Even the Vajra Nadi that is within the Sushumna doesn't lead to the goal, and I'm not going to repeat myself because I'm sure you've done your job. You went through the module attentively enough. Let alone the parallel to Ida and Pingala, the so-called Saraswati and Lakshmi. So, the reason why Kundalini can take undesirable pathway to ascent is of course linked to this, what taking place right at the moment in time prior to the release of Kundalini. Whatever we have accumulated in terms of our impressions at every level we can speak about, whatever is the condition of our nervous system, our physiology as well, because that's all inseparable, and of course, above all else, the state of our subtle body will impact and affect the rising of the Kundalini. In other words, it will impact or affect which pathway Kundalini will choose or discover. Because if at the entrance to Sushumna, which can only happen, traditionally speaking, when the pericarp is opened, when the Brahma Granthi, or that what is in Mul Trikona, right, going back to that Shaiva language, where the entrance to the Sushumna channel is closed. And what can result in the closure? It could be from trauma to stress to the accumulation of so much psychic material that Kundalini cannot have access. And yet the condition is undoubtedly for Kundalini to release itself from that so-called state of slumber in her coiled state. So she will do everything to uncurl, and will look for a potential other opening. Whatever will be available at a given moment in time, since it cannot travel through myriad of other nadis, because they are deemed unfit, and this is also due to the subtle structure of the subtle anatomy. This is all more so to do with the connection that Shankini Nadi has, which at Muladhara connects to the higher cortexes through the myriad of ways. But Kundalini cannot travel through this myriad of ways. It needs to choose one single Nadi. So this is the uniqueness of that unfoldment of consciousness at that level. So whatever will be opened at the given moment in time. Why? Because the appropriate pathway is waxed, as it were, clogged. Indeed, due to accumulated impressions, samskaric field is not cleared enough. And it will then repeatedly use that pathway because that's what it then knows. So, and you further asking whether this in time, and if one is given to sadhana, would repair, and you use this in inverted commas, the pathway for the Kundalini to, as far as I understand, to redirect itself. Again, we spoke about that, and remember that it's almost as if there is certain propensity because it knows already and has trodden the pathway. So unless some radical changes being brought in, unless the possibility for Kundalini to redirect its flow, which here would be impossible without the melting out of that, what the samskaric field, let's say here, is exemplified by those impressions which clog the entrance into the appropriate entrance through the sushumna. So if that's the case, and that is the only real legitimate possibility, because if it continue traveling sideways in any of the inappropriately chosen channels, then in itself it creates that kind of connection and circuit, especially when it comes to something like Vajranadi. Vajranadi creates an addictive life quality to that particular ascent. Because don't forget, Vajranadi in itself is associated with the arousal, sexual arousal. So, as well as giving these elated experiences that all orgasmic experiences associated with. After all, don't forget, with every ascent, even through the inappropriate channel, if it reaches the higher cortexes, it does something to the brains. So in other words, the being still experiencing some kind of enrichment and opening and unfoldment. It only with time it begins to dawn on the person that coveted, that kind of, well, maybe the sense of innate wisdom and knowledge begins to present itself, that that's not the real deal. And this is, by the way, not at all uncommon. I want to say this out loud because a lot of people now these days go through Kundalini process. The fact that in majority of these cases it's not a proper Kundalini process, in a sense that what the Kundalini process represents has been already spoken about. But even with those in whom it is in fact not just any pranic activity, not just any energetic movements, but factual Kundalini activity, in a lot of these cases, this is inappropriate ascent because it's a day and age we live in. And this is why perhaps that sense of dissatisfaction eventually begins to dominate the state of affairs. So if the person is driven, if the person is connected to this, and also this is again linked to certain predispositions, if the tamasic qualities are on a way out, and there is this, with the rise of sattva, with the rise of that more illuminating qualities and the intuition, it will guide one on to the proper path where one will look for solutions and look for guidance. And then the Kundalini process can be rerouted. As I said earlier, it is perfectly adjustable. So it's not something, we're not speaking here about rare cases of Kundalini falling. That's totally different ball game. So let's not confuse that. Falling Kundalini and Kundalini rising through inappropriate channels is not one and the same thing. Yes, there is defecting rising and deflecting rising. So deflecting rising is easier to adjust than something which falls under the category of falling Kundalini. But not to anchor ourselves too much into this, I want to continue with the questions. Second set of questions here, or rather it's just one. I would be very grateful for your assessment and advice on what I can do to be able to be in service and also to be able to have joyful relationships. Well, this squarely falls into that trust that every relationship requires and should be invited into. You can't afford to have, what I'm saying is that any one of us who is really, having brush with the divine and going through this process can't afford to fall back into so-called, let's call them usual, normal relationships, where you are afraid, insecure, intimidated by being in the presence of someone with whom you're sharing your life, with whom you're being intimate, because whatever stage and nature of your process. This simply goes without saying. It's impossible. Maybe for those for whom it's in a very, very mild and in the very early phases, one can kind of hide behind this and hide that away. But if this is happening to you, this also an invitation to reconsider this, that education is required on your part and on the part of the partner with whom you happen to be. They need to understand, and even if they cannot understand, even if they cannot relate to it, relate in the sense that it is obvious if the person doesn't go through this process, they cannot understand it in that visceral sense. But they can relate to it from another point of view. And that relating should come from a very healthy ground. In other words, the information they take, the information they are being educated, and where the assessment of what is going on should always be rooted in something wholesome. Because if they somehow get hold of second-hand information about Kundalini, I'll just give you myriad of examples, and you can, not myriad, few examples, and you can come up with your own. Let's say someone who has a quite considerably strong religious background, be it a Muslim, I don't know, Catholic, whatever, where often these energetic symptoms are being viewed with not just suspicion, but in some cases being pathologized or even viewed as possessions. In Christianity this could be, and for a very long time has been dubbed as satanic, possessions. And so of course, if this person may not say it out loud, but if that's what they feel, then that's not helpful at all. At all. Let's say they don't have that religious somehow attitude, and they just, come from that secular background in their upbringing, but they might have this perspective which is rooted in the so-called current understanding of what healthy human psyche represents. This may not be helpful either, because they might view this through the lenses of something going wrong in your nervous system. You need to see a specialist. In other words, it is being pathologized. And it may be done, most likely, from the place of compassion, care, but it's not done from a place of deep understanding, real understanding, lack of course, knowledge and information about this. So the person may begin to have that inadvertently innate attitude of relating towards someone with whom they are and who is going through the process, and if they are involved, love them like, like as if the person is sick, like have that some secret hidden illness, which is far from, this is a completely bizarre, unhelpful, and in fact perverted understanding, because that understanding rooted on complete lack of proper information in the culture of day and age we live in. So you see, this will not be helpful either. So what I'm trying to say to you here is that because that aspect of it's difficult to be in a relationship, you're saying that. Yes, indeed, it is. And yet you can't afford to hide it. Not that you need to wear it on your sleeve, and because then that in itself, it's like you're not a victim here. Human being who is going through a process of awakening needs to be understood what that is. And if we do, then no one ever in the right mind will ever make any attempts to pathologize that. If anything, reverse perspectives were often given by spiritual adepts that the rest of the world is walking around numb sleepwalkers. I don't usually, and not necessarily always agree with that, because that also has a sort kind of like insider perspective on the outside world. Everyone around me is asleep, and I'm the only awake one and the chosen few around me. That's not quite helpful either. It can create and feed that sense of exclusivity. It creates crevices where that spiritual ego can find, it can kind of like brush up its ruffled feathers and get ready to fly again and to be in charge. Best to have this a proper understanding that everyone is Shiva in disguise. There's nothing other than consciousness. Everyone. But the way how Shiva, through prana, Kundalini, expresses its power for unlimited way of displaying its creativity, then some people simply in that state of homeostasis, slumber. They are in a state of that enchanted fascination with a dream. Maybe that is a better analogy. Just enchanted. Everything is so real, so enchanted, and yet somehow still two-dimensional. And this is what awakening presents. It's like suddenly canvas is turned. torn. Like that Pinocchio who comes to that canvas where the picture of the stove, right? The flames and the boiling, wok, whatever that is, and poke his nose and creates a hole in the canvas. So it creates that entrance and access into another reality, which makes this reality maybe at some point rendered asunder to whatever degree, depending on where we find ourselves in the journey, less real, more like being perceived through the veil. And before adjustments takes place in that relationship between, all this, what is all here subject to perception, dynamics between subject and object, adjust itself beautifully again in that seamlessness of that experience. It may be at the expense of one or the other, you see? So going back to the, you're seeking advice here, so my only advice is to be truthful to yourself. You have no choice. It's the only solution. And you have to be courageous and open about it with yourself and with your partner. And especially when you present that, there has to be this healthy, mutual middle ground of how this is presented. Because we can fall into extremes. At one end of that extreme, we can present it as going through some bizarre, crazy thing, called Kundalini, and my body twitches and, I'm doing this and that, so please bear with me, I don't know. I hope it will subside one day, right? Are you all right with that, darling? But don't worry, I'm okay in every other way. Another extreme is like, coming into, it's like riding a lion, Durga, who the heck are you? I'm the goddess, I'm awakened and you're sleepy little whatever, you better, get recognition of who you're dealing with. So there is a middle ground between these extremes of falling into the victim of circumstances, I'm awakened, versus I'm the woo-hoo-hoo, So always good to have that middle ground. That guy on my right, he said it, right? Set it forth. Middle way. Middle way. Not to fall prey into any of the extremes.